It started with a card. February 14th was just another day to me. Romance wasn't my thing and my single status was a badge of honor. My coworkers, however, were all abuzz about roses, chocolates, and candlelit dinners. The break room was a shrine to pink and red decorations, and even my gruff boss was sporting a heart-shaped lapel pin. I was sipping my coffee when I found it. A simple white envelope on my desk. No name, no stamp. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a single card, its surface embossed with delicate roses. In shimmering red script it read, "Be mine forever." There was no signature. At first I thought it was a joke. Maybe a secret admirer, or more likely, a prank from one of my coworkers who knew how much I disliked Valentine's Day. I tucked the card into my bag and went about my day. But as the hours dragged on, I began to feel off. It was a sensation I couldn't quite place, like being watched from a corner of the room where no one was standing. By the time I got home, the feeling had intensified. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt oppressive. The lights seemed dimmer, the air colder. I tossed the card onto the kitchen counter, intending to forget about it, but the moment it left my hand, a strange sound filled the air. A whisper. I froze, listening. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Words, though I couldn't make them out. I turned, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to stress. That night I dreamed of roses. They were everywhere, vibrant red petals scattered across an endless black void. In the center stood a figure, shrouded in shadow. It held something out to me, the card. I woke in a cold sweat, the whispering still echoing in my ears. The card was no longer on the counter. I found it on my bedside table, propped up like a photo. The words on the front seemed brighter, the red ink almost wet. "Be mine forever." My hands shook as I picked it up, flipping it over in hopes of finding some rational explanation. But the back was blank, smooth as glass. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Do you like my gift?" Panic set in. I typed a reply demanding to know who they were, but the message wouldn't send. My phone froze, the screen flickering before going dark. When it rebooted, the text was gone. I decided to throw the card away. I grabbed it, along with the junk mail piling up on my table, and stuffed it into the trash. For the rest of the day, I tried to convince myself it was over. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whisper again. Closer this time. The sound was coming from the kitchen. Heart pounding, I crept down the hallway, flipping on every light as I went. The trash can was empty. The card was back on the counter, standing upright. Beside it was a single red rose, its petals unnaturally vibrant. I didn't put that there. I grabbed the card, ready to rip it in half, but the moment my fingers touched it, pain shot up my arm. Images flooded my mind, flashes of blood-red roses, of dark voids, of the shadowed figure from my dream. It spoke, its voice low and guttural. "You accepted my gift. You are mine." The next morning I tried to leave town. I packed a bag, booked a hotel miles away, and hit the road. But no matter how far I drove, the whisper followed. At the hotel I found the card waiting for me on the bed. Beside it was another rose. I couldn't run. That was weeks ago. Now I'm trapped in my apartment, unable to leave. The roses are everywhere, growing from the walls, the floors, even the windows. Their thorny vines snake through the air, cutting off any chance of escape. The whispers have grown louder, almost deafening. The shadowed figure has started to appear in the corner of my vision, closer each time I turn my head. The card sits on my bedside table, the words glowing in the dim light. "Be mine forever." I understand now. It wasn't a gift. It was a curse. It was a rainy evening when I first saw it. I was walking home from work, the kind of long, dreary commute that makes you question your life choices. The rain came down in sheets, blurring the city lights into a smudged painting. My umbrella, a cheap, fraying thing I'd bought at a corner store, barely kept me dry, and the cold wind gnawed at my hands. That's when I noticed the black umbrella. It stood out, leaning against the wall of a closed cafe. Sleek and polished, with a curved wooden handle, It looked out of place amid the dilapidated storefronts and cracked sidewalks. I wouldn't have paid it any mind if it hadn't been for the note attached to it. A single piece of paper dangled from the handle, the words written in precise, flowing script. "Take me. I'll keep you safe." I should have walked away. But I didn't. My own umbrella flipped inside out for the third time that evening, and in a moment of frustration I grabbed the black umbrella. It felt oddly warm in my hand, the kind of comforting warmth you'd feel from a fireplace on a cold winter night. The rain seemed to soften as I walked under its canopy. The world grew quieter, the distant sound of traffic and the pattering of raindrops muffled. For the first time in hours I felt at ease. It wasn't until I reached my apartment that I realized I hadn't seen another soul on the way home. The black umbrella became my go-to. It wasn't just functional, it was perfect. No matter how hard the rain fell or how fierce the wind blew, the umbrella never wavered. It was as if the elements bent around me, unwilling to touch whoever held it. But then the dreams began. At first they were vague, a sensation of being followed, of shadows moving just beyond my vision. Over time they grew more vivid. I would find myself in unfamiliar streets, the rain pouring harder than I'd ever seen, yet I was dry beneath the black umbrella. And always there was a figure in the distance. A silhouette standing motionless in the downpour watching me. One evening as I walked home I noticed something strange. The umbrella's shadow wasn't behaving as it should. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but no matter how I turned or angled it, the shadow moved independently. It stretched longer when there was no source of light and swayed when the umbrella was perfectly still. I began to feel uneasy, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. The thought of walking in the rain without its protection felt wrong. The next day I woke to find the umbrella in my bedroom. I was certain I had left it by the door, but there it was, leaning against the foot of my bed. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something new. The note that had once dangled from the handle was back, but the message had changed. "Don't leave me." I stared at it for a long time before crumpling the note and shoving the umbrella into the closet. That night the rain came down harder than ever. The sound of rain tapping against the window usually lulled me to sleep, but tonight it was different. It wasn't rhythmic, it was erratic, almost as if something was clawing at the glass. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but then I heard the creak. It came from the closet. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. Another creak, followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping. I couldn't bring myself to move, frozen by the suffocating silence that followed. Then slowly the closet door began to open. The black umbrella fell out, landing on the floor with a thud. I stared at it, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But it just lay there, inert and harmless. Against my better judgment, I got up and picked it up. The warmth was gone. The handle felt cold, almost damp, and when I tilted it, a single drop of water fell to the floor. Only it wasn't water. It was red. From that night on, the umbrella's presence became oppressive. I tried throwing it away, but no matter where I left it, it always returned. Once, I hurled it into the river, only to find it leaning against my door the next morning, dripping wet. I started seeing the silhouette from my dreams and waking life. It would appear on the opposite side of the street, motionless under its own black umbrella. One night, I found it standing outside my window, staring up at me. Desperate, I reached out to an antique dealer, hoping they could tell me something about the umbrella's origin. The moment they saw it, their face paled. "Where did you get this?" they whispered. I explained and they shook their head. "You need to get rid of it. Burn it if you can." I tried. The umbrella wouldn't catch fire. The silhouette grew bolder. It followed me into my building, its footsteps echoing behind me in the stairwell. It stood at the foot of my bed, its face obscured by shadows, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I was losing sleep, my mind unraveling. Then one rainy evening, it spoke clearly for the first time. "You took me. Now I'll take you." I woke up in the middle of the street, the rain pouring down around me. The black umbrella was in my hand, but it no longer shielded me. I was soaked, shivering, and utterly alone. The streets were unfamiliar, the buildings looming like giants in the mist. In the distance, I saw the silhouette waiting, its umbrella tilted just enough to reveal a hollow, grinning face. I dropped the umbrella and ran. They found me 3 days later, wandering a forest miles from the city. I was barefoot, clutching a broken, black umbrella. I don't remember how I got there, but every time it rains I hear the tapping. It's coming for me. And next time I won't be able to run. It all started with a craving. I was wandering through the aisles of an old country store, the kind that always smelled like wood polish and memories. The shelves were packed with goods, jars of pickles, preserves, and jam stacked neatly, their colorful labels faded with time. But one jar caught my eye. It was strawberry jam, nestled at the back of the shelf, almost hidden. The jar looked handmade, its label written in uneven, scrawling handwriting that read, Eleanor's Strawberry Bliss. The vibrant red color of the jam seemed brighter, richer than any I'd ever seen. The cashier, an elderly woman with gnarled hands and a distant gaze, hesitated when I placed the jar on the counter. "Are you sure about this one?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. "Why wouldn't I be?" I replied, puzzled. She stared at the jar for a long moment before ringing it up. "Just, don't eat it alone." That night the craving won. I toasted some bread, letting the golden aroma fill my tiny apartment. The jam spread like silk, its texture smoother than anything I'd tasted before. I took a bite and my senses were overwhelmed. It was perfect. The sweetness wasn't cloying, and the flavor was so intense that it felt almost alive. I devoured slice after slice until the jar was half empty. But then the whispers started. At first I thought it was the wind. A faint murmur seemed to drift through my kitchen, too soft to make out any words. I ignored it and continued eating, but the whispers grew louder. They sounded close, too close. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. Only the jar sat on the counter, the label now oddly askew. The whispers stopped the moment I looked at it. That night I dreamt of strawberries. Fields of them stretched endlessly under a blood-red sky. The air smelled sickly sweet, and the berries seemed unnaturally large, their surfaces glistening like raw meat. I wandered through the fields, my hands brushing against the fruit. But when I looked down, the strawberries were bleeding, their crimson juices pooling around my feet. A figure appeared in the distance. A woman in a long dress, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, stood silently among the plants. She pointed at me with a hand stained red. I woke up gasping, the taste of strawberries still lingering in my mouth. The next morning the jar was on my bedside table. I was certain I'd left it in the kitchen. My stomach churned at the sight of it, but the craving returned, stronger than ever. I grabbed a spoon and dipped it directly into the jar. The jam tasted different this time, richer, darker, with an underlying bitterness. I couldn't stop myself, spoon after spoon disappearing until I scraped the bottom of the jar. That's when I saw it. Embedded in the last bit of jam was something small and metallic. I fished it out and wiped it clean. It was a locket, its surface etched with tiny strawberries. Inside was a picture of the woman from my dream. The whispers returned, louder than ever. I tried to drown them out with music, but they grew insistent, calling my name in a chorus of soft, rasping voices. The jam jar was back on the counter, somehow full again. The label, now completely peeled off, revealed something carved into the glass. Property of Eleanor. Do not steal. My hands trembled as I threw the jar into the trash, but the whispers didn't stop. That night I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving from the kitchen toward my bedroom. My heart pounded as I clutched my phone, but the screen refused to light up. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, the air thick with the sickly sweet smell of strawberries. The door creaked open and there she was. The woman from my dream. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and hollow. She held the jar in one hand, the locket dangling from the other. "You ate what wasn't yours," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "Now you belong to the field." I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was surrounded by endless strawberry fields under a blood-red sky. The air was heavy, the smell of strawberries suffocating. I tried to run, but my feet sank into the soil. I looked down to see roots growing from my legs, twisting and anchoring me to the ground. The woman appeared again, her hollow eyes filled with a cruel satisfaction. "You're one of mine now," she said. I screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was a new jar being placed on a shelf, my name scrawled across the label. And somewhere, someone else is craving strawberry jam. Tanjung Perak Harbor was a hive of activity at all hours. Workers loaded and unloaded crates, ships came and went, and the air carried the mingling scents of saltwater and diesel fuel. Yet beneath the bustling exterior, whispers of strange occurrences at the harbor had been circulating among the locals for decades. I never gave much thought to the rumors. As a freelance journalist looking for a good story, I often chased urban legends, but they rarely amounted to more than exaggerated tales. When I heard about the mysterious disappearances at Tanjung Perak, I was intrigued but skeptical. The harbor workers spoke of shadowy figures seen after sunset, strange sounds echoing from the water, and an abandoned cargo ship that appeared and disappeared without explanation. It was late October when I decided to investigate. The air was thick with humidity that night, the faint glow of the harbor lights reflecting off the water. I made my way past the busy docks, where workers shouted orders and forklifts rumbled by. Further away, in the quieter parts of the harbor, I could hear the lapping of waves against the pilings and the occasional squawk of a seagull. My destination was the farthest berth, a derelict pier long since abandoned. According to the workers, this was where the ghost ship often appeared. They called it Kapal Jelap, the dark ship. I set up my camera and recorder, noting the eerie stillness of the area. The pier was rotting in places, the wood creaking under my weight. The smell of decay mingled with the salty breeze, making my stomach churn. Hours passed and the harbor grew silent. It was nearing midnight when I first heard the sound, a low, mournful horn echoing across the water. At first I thought it was just another ship signaling its arrival. But as I scanned the horizon, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the main channel. It was closer, somewhere near the abandoned pier. The fog rolled in thick and fast, shrouding the area in a ghostly haze. The air grew colder, and the water beneath the pier seemed to darken unnaturally. Then I saw it, a massive silhouette emerging from the mist. It was a ship, but not like any I'd seen before. Its hull was covered in barnacles and rust, and its sails, though tattered, were eerily pristine. The name painted on the side was barely legible, but I could make out the word Lot Lane, Other Sea. I should have run, but curiosity anchored me in place. The ship docked silently, its gangplank lowering with a slow, groaning creak. No one emerged, but I felt a presence, a suffocating heaviness that made my skin crawl. Against all logic, I stepped onto the gangplank and ascended. The air grew colder with each step, and the sounds of the harbor faded until only the lapping of water remained. The deck was empty, the wood slick with algae. Ropes hung loosely, swaying as though moved by unseen hands. I raised my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick mist. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was a distant whisper, soft and unintelligible, like the echo of a forgotten conversation. The interior of the ship was worse. The corridors were narrow, the air damp and foul. The walls seemed to close in as I moved deeper, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, clinking faintly as if disturbed by a breeze that didn't exist. I found the cargo hold first. Crates stacked haphazardly filled the space, their labels faded or written in languages I couldn't recognize. One crate was partially open, revealing its contents, old, waterlogged journals and photographs. The faces in the photos were blurred, their eyes scratched out. A noise behind me made me freeze. It was faint at first, a rhythmic tapping like someone walking barefoot across the deck. I turned, my flashlight flickering. A figure stood at the far end of the hold. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a hood. Its hands were skeletal, dripping with water that pooled on the floor. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder. Whispers filled the room, overlapping and growing louder until they became deafening. I ran. The corridors twisted unnaturally as I tried to find my way back to the deck. Every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the ship, the walls oozing brackish water. Doors slammed shut behind me and shadows danced just out of reach. The whispers followed, growing closer, their words now clear. "Join us, you belong to the sea?" I burst onto the deck, gasping for air. The gangplank was gone, the pier a distant memory. The ship was adrift, surrounded by an endless expanse of black water. The figure was there, standing at the helm. It raised a hand, pointing at me. The whispers became a roar, the air vibrating with their intensity. I don't remember jumping, but I found myself in the freezing water, thrashing as the ship loomed overhead. When I surfaced, the harbor lights were visible in the distance. The lot lane was gone, swallowed by the mist. I crawled onto the pier, shivering and gasping. My camera and recorder were gone, lost to the depths. Only the photographs remained, waterlogged and smeared with salt. The faces in them were no longer scratched out. They were screaming. To this day I avoid Tanjung Perak Harbor. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the mournful horn echoing across the water. And I know the Kapal Jelap is still out there, waiting for its next passenger. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the tiny bakery on Main Street. Mr. Grigori's bakery was a staple in our town, a place where people gathered for soft croissants, crusty baguettes, and most famously his burger buns. They were the perfect combination of fluffy and dense, with a golden sheen that seemed to glow under the shop's lights. But recently, something felt off about Mr. Grigori's buns. I first noticed it during the town's annual Burger Bash. The event was a highlight of the year, where restaurants and home cooks competed to make the best burger. Everyone swore by Mr. Grigori's buns, believing they elevated any patty to a masterpiece. This year the buns were different. The texture was slightly firmer, and there was a faint metallic aftertaste. Yet no one seemed to mind. If anything, people raved about how they were even better than before. Except for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The taste lingered in a way that wasn't natural, like the residue of an unspoken secret. My curiosity got the better of me, and the following week I visited the bakery. The shop was quieter than usual, the typical hum of conversation replaced by an eerie stillness. Mr. Grigori stood behind the counter, his apron smeared with flour and grease. He looked older than I remembered, his once rosy complexion pale and ashen. "Ah, you're here for the buns," he said, his voice rough and distant. "Actually," I replied, trying to sound casual, "I was wondering if you could tell me your secret. Everyone's talking about the new recipe." He froze for a moment, his eyes darting to the back room. "It's nothing special. Just a new supplier for some ingredients." His answer was curt, almost dismissive, and it only fueled my suspicion. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of Mr. Grigori's hollow stare haunted me, and the metallic aftertaste of the bun lingered on my tongue. I decided to investigate. I returned to the bakery just after midnight, armed with a flashlight and a determination I couldn't explain. The shop was locked, but the side entrance to the kitchen was secured only with an old, rusted latch. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of yeast and something else, something foul and rancid. I moved cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The kitchen looked normal at first, trays of dough rising, bags of flour stacked neatly, and ovens cooling from the day's work. But then I noticed the trapdoor in the corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of empty sacks. The hinges groaned as I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness. The stench grew stronger and my stomach churned with every step. At the bottom was a dimly lit cellar. It was cluttered with barrels and crates, but what caught my attention was the large, industrial mixer in the center of the room. Its metal bowl was streaked with red, and nearby, a table held an assortment of knives, cleavers, and what looked like a bone saw. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement in the shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the faint hum of machinery. I approached the mixer, my hands shaking. Inside the bowl was a thick, viscous substance that smelled metallic and sickly sweet. I dipped a finger into it, a foolish impulse, and brought it to my nose. Blood. I pulled back, nearly tripping over a crate. My flashlight fell, its beam landing on something partially hidden beneath a tarp. I hesitated, then pulled the tarp away. What I saw will haunt me forever. Beneath the tarp were dozens of bones, neatly cleaned and arranged. Some were unmistakably human, while others looked like they came from animals. A low growl echoed through the cellar. I spun around, my flashlight shaking. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Grigori. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm but menacing. What is this?" I stammered, gesturing toward the bones and the bloodied mixer. He sighed, his shoulders slumping as if under an unbearable weight. "It started with the flour shortage," he said. "People didn't notice when I used animal fat to stretch the dough. Then, well, accidents happen." "Accidents?" My voice rose in disbelief. He nodded. "A drifter looking for a place to sleep. He broke in one night and—" I panicked. His eyes gleamed with a strange mix of guilt and pride. "But the buns, they've never been better. People crave them now. I couldn't stop even if I wanted to." He took a step toward me and I backed away. "You don't understand," he continued. "This isn't just about the buns. It's about something older. Something that demands tribute." Before I could respond, the growl returned, louder and closer. The shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into a hulking, otherworldly figure. Its eyes burned like embers, and its elongated jaws dripped with a dark, viscous fluid. "It lives beneath the harbor," Mr. Grigori whispered. "It feeds on the offerings I bake. The buns keep it satiated, and keep us safe." The creature lunged and I bolted up the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was safely back in my apartment, the bakery far behind me. I tried to go to the police, but my story sounded insane. By the time they investigated, the bakery was spotless, the trapdoor sealed and hidden. Mr. Grigori disappeared soon after, and the bakery closed. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a whiff of freshly baked bread mixed with that metallic tang, and I know the creature is still out there, waiting for its next tribute. And I can't help but wonder, how many of us have already tasted it? The Australian outback is a vast, enigmatic place, a desert of infinite red sands and boundless horizons. For years, stories have been whispered about its untamed wilds, about creatures that lurk just beyond the reach of firelight, and shadows that stretch too far in the moonlight. But those were just tales, weren't they? I was an amateur filmmaker, traveling to the outback for a documentary project on Australia's lesser-known myths. My guide, Lucas, was a rugged local with a skeptical smile and a wealth of knowledge about the land. He laughed off my interest in the supernatural. "Mate, it's just the heat and the isolation that gets to people," he said as we loaded our gear into his battered 4x4. "But hey, if you're chasing ghost stories, the outback's got plenty." Our destination was an abandoned mining settlement called Black Hollow. Once a booming opal town, it was deserted decades ago after a series of mysterious deaths. The locals refused to discuss it, dismissing the deaths as accidents or the result of minor squabbles. But there was a deeper unease in their eyes, a tension that hinted at something they didn't want to say. It took us 2 days to reach Black Hollow. The journey was grueling, the heat relentless, and the desolation unsettling. The radio lost signal hours before we arrived, leaving us with only the sound of the engine and the ever-present wind. By the time we reached the settlement, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the crumbling buildings. Black Hollow was eerie in its silence. The remnants of the town consisted of a few dilapidated shacks, a rusting water tower, and the yawning black mouth of the old mine. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, as if the place was holding its breath. We set up camp near the water tower and Lucas built a fire. As we ate, I asked him about the stories surrounding the town. "They say the miners dug too deep," he said, his voice low. "Found something they shouldn't have. After that, people started disappearing. First it was just 1 or 2. Then entire families." "What did they find?" I asked. Lucas shrugged. Depends who you ask. Some say it was a cursed opal. Others reckon it was something alive. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the hollowed-out buildings, carrying with it faint, indistinct whispers. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination and forced myself to focus on the project. At dawn we explored the mine. The entrance was partially caved in, but we managed to squeeze through. Inside the air was cool and stale, the walls lined with faintly glimmering opals. My flashlight beam danced over the stone, revealing crude carvings etched into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize. "Lucas," I called out. "Have you seen these before?" He frowned, running his fingers over the carvings. "No. And I've been to a lot of mines." The deeper we went, the more unsettling the carvings became. They depicted figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, always watching, always reaching. Then we found the pit. A massive, gaping hole in the earth, surrounded by abandoned tools and shredded ropes. The air here felt heavier, almost suffocating. As I leaned over the edge, a faint sound drifted up from the darkness, a low, rhythmic hum that sent chills down my spine. "Let's head back," Lucas said abruptly. We returned to the surface, but the unease lingered. As we packed up our equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, but every time I turned there was nothing there. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They seemed to come from all around, rising and falling like a chant. I sat by the fire, gripping my camera, when Lucas emerged from his tent, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could respond, the fire dimmed as if a great wind had passed over it. But the air was still. Then we saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering like mirages. They were impossibly tall, their limbs unnaturally long, and their eyes glowing with an eerie, opalescent light. Lucas grabbed my arm. "Run?" We bolted toward the 4x4, but the figures moved faster than seemed possible, their limbs bending and stretching in ways that defied logic. As we reached the vehicle, one of them lunged, its hand grazing my shoulder. A searing cold shot through me, and for a moment the world blurred. I saw flashes of the pit, the carvings, and the miners, their faces twisted in terror as they fled from something unseen. Lucas shoved me into the passenger seat and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the figures, their hollow eyes staring as the vehicle roared to life. We drove through the night, the figures pursuing us for miles before finally fading into the darkness. When we reached the nearest town, Lucas refused to speak of what had happened. I reviewed my footage, hoping to make sense of it. The recordings were distorted, filled with static and fleeting images of the figures. But the audio was clear, the whispers, the hum from the pit, and one chilling phrase repeated over and over. "You dug too deep." To this day, I don't know what we encountered in Black Hollow. Lucas left town shortly after, and the locals refused to answer my questions. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the hollow figures and hear the rhythmic hum. And I can't help but wonder, what else lies hidden beneath the red sands of the outback? Highways are built to take you somewhere, linking cities, towns, and lives. But there's one stretch of asphalt deep in the middle of nowhere that's different. Locals call it Route 13, though it doesn't appear on any map. Some say it's cursed, others claim it doesn't exist at all. Yet those who've driven it, those who have survived, know it's real. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. I was driving across the country to start a new job, eager for a fresh start. My route took me through endless plains, the kind of scenery that feels the same for miles on end. I'd been on the road for hours when my GPS suddenly rerouted me. Shortcut detected. Estimated time saved, 30 minutes? The screen showed a thin, unmarked road splitting off from the main highway. I hesitated for a moment but shrugged. 30 minutes was 30 minutes. The turnoff was subtle, almost hidden. The asphalt looked older, cracked and faded. Still, it didn't seem unusual for a backroad. I turned onto it, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The first hour passed uneventfully, though I noticed the road didn't quite feel right. It wasn't just the condition of the pavement, It was the way it stretched endlessly, with no curves, no hills, and no signs of life. I checked the GPS again. My car icon moved, but the surrounding map had vanished, replaced by a blank gray expanse. I tapped the screen, but it froze, then flickered. Recalculating? The voice was distorted, robotic, almost wrong. By the second hour, I began to feel uneasy. The landscape outside had changed subtly but unnervingly. What had once been plains and fields was now barren, the earth cracked and dry. There were no trees, no animals, just an expanse of lifeless dirt stretching to the horizon. And the highway kept going, perfectly straight, with no end in sight. I started to notice shapes in the distance. At first I thought they were rocks or maybe abandoned vehicles. But as I got closer, they didn't make sense. They looked like figures. I slowed the car, my headlights catching their forms. They stood by the roadside, unmoving, their faces obscured by shadow. My pulse quickened. As I passed, I realized they weren't people at all. They were statues. The statues became more frequent, lining the road like silent sentinels. Each one was different. A man holding his head in his hands, a woman reaching out, a child frozen mid-run. Their faces were twisted, contorted in expressions of fear and anguish. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel tighter with each passing mile. The air in the car felt heavier, colder. The GPS had given up entirely, its screen black. Then the static started. It came from the radio, though I hadn't turned it on. The sound crackled and hissed, punctuated by faint whispers. I tried to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. They sounded guttural, ancient. A chill ran down my spine as the dashboard lights began to flicker. And then I saw it. In the distance, illuminated by my high beams, was a figure standing in the middle of the road. Unlike the statues, it moved. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The figure didn't flinch. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated and its head tilted at an impossible angle. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then it started walking toward me. Panic set in. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the cracked asphalt. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, the road behind me was gone. Instead, there was only darkness, an impenetrable void that swallowed everything. I had no choice but to go forward. The figure continued to approach, its movements jerky and unnatural. As I inched closer, its features became clearer. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were black voids. And it was smiling. I swerved to avoid it, the car skidding onto the shoulder. When I looked back, it was gone. The statues were everywhere now, their faces more twisted in pain than before. The static in the radio had become deafening, drowning out my thoughts. I turned the wheel wildly, trying to find an exit, but the highway offered no turnoffs, no intersections, just an endless, straight path. The whispers returned, louder this time, and with them came laughter. It was faint at first, then maniacal, echoing inside the car. The laughter stopped abruptly as the car's engine sputtered. The headlights dimmed, then went out entirely, leaving me in total darkness. I tried the ignition, but the car was dead. The only sound was my own breathing, rapid and shallow. Then from the shadows I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, drawing closer. I locked the doors, my fingers trembling, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The footsteps stopped just outside my window. For a moment there was silence. Then a soft tap on the glass. I couldn't bring myself to look. The tap came again, louder this time. Then a voice, a low, raspy whisper. "Why did you take this road?" I woke up hours later, slumped over the wheel. The car was parked at the edge of a familiar highway, the morning sun rising in the distance. Everything seemed normal. No statues, no figures, no whispers. But as I looked at the GPS, a chill ran through me. The screen displayed a single message. Route completed. Turn back? I didn't, and I never will. There's a village nestled deep in the Austrian Alps, untouched by time. It's a place few speak of and fewer still dare to visit. Known to locals as Geistertal or Ghost Valley, the village is rumored to harbor a secret, a darkness hidden behind its picturesque facade. I first heard of Jakarta from a travel blog. The post described it as a hidden gem with stunning landscapes and architecture dating back to the 17th century. The photos were enchanting: cobblestone streets, charming wooden houses, and a grand ballroom that seemed out of place in such a small village. As a travel photographer, I couldn't resist the allure. The blog's author warned that the village was difficult to find and that the locals were peculiar. But I chalked it up to exaggeration. After all, who wouldn't be wary of strangers in a place so isolated? It was late autumn when I arrived in Austria. The air was crisp, and the leaves painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. I rented a car and followed the blog's vague directions, which led me up winding roads and through dense forests. By the time I reached Jakarta, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village. The streets were eerily quiet, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. As I parked my car and stepped out, I noticed something strange. There were no sounds. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, not even the distant hum of life. It was as if the village existed in a vacuum. The first person I met was an elderly woman sweeping the steps of her home. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes narrowing. "Guten Abend," I greeted her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stared at me for a moment before retreating inside, slamming the door shut. Shrugging off the cold reception, I wandered through the village, snapping photos. The architecture was stunning, just as the blog had described. But as I reviewed the shots on my camera, I noticed something odd. In every photo, the buildings appeared slightly distorted, their angles sharper, more menacing. And in the windows, shadows loomed where there should have been none. Night fell quickly, and I realized I hadn't booked a place to stay. The blog mentioned an inn near the center of the village, so I made my way there. The innkeeper, a wiry man with deep-set eyes, greeted me with a forced smile. "You're staying the night?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. He hesitated, then handed me a key. "Room 7. Keep your curtains closed." The warning unsettled me, but I didn't press for an explanation. The room was simple yet cozy, with a large window overlooking the village square. I closed the curtains as instructed but couldn't resist peeking out. The square was empty, save for a single figure standing in the center. It was a man in a black suit, motionless, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He stood there for hours, unmoving, until the clock struck midnight. At the stroke of 12, music filled the air, a haunting waltz that seemed to come from nowhere. I pulled the curtains open and my breath caught in my throat. The square was now filled with people, all dressed in elegant 18th century attire. They danced in perfect synchrony, their movements fluid yet unnaturally stiff. And their faces, they had no eyes, no mouths, just smooth, featureless skin. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. The music grew louder, more oppressive, until it felt like it was inside my head. A knock came at the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. But the knocking continued, relentless. Summoning my courage, I flung the door open. The hallway was empty. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and chilling, coming from behind me. "Dance with us." I spun around, but the room was empty. The music outside had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I grabbed my camera and decided to leave. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw the innkeeper standing at the far end, his back to me. "Sir?" I called out. He turned slowly, his face blank and featureless like the dancers outside. Panic set in and I ran down the stairs out into the night. The village was dark and empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I made it to my car and started the engine, but the headlights revealed something that made my blood run cold. The villagers stood in a circle around the square, their eyeless faces all turned toward me. I floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the village and down the mountain road. The music followed me, faint at first, then growing louder as if chasing me. When I finally reached the highway, the sound stopped. I pulled over, my hands shaking, and looked back. The road behind me was empty, the village nowhere in sight. Back home, I reviewed the photos I had taken. Every image was warped, the buildings twisted, the shadows in the windows unmistakably human-shaped. But the final photo was the most chilling. It was a shot of the village square taken from my window. In the center stood a single figure staring directly at the camera. It was me. They say no one leaves Jakarta unchanged. Some never leave at all. And though I escaped, the haunting melody of that soundless waltz lingers in my dreams, calling me back to the dance. I've been a roadie for nearly a decade, lugging amps and guitars for bands that teeter between obscurity and stardom. It's a tough gig, but the perks, free concerts, the occasional backstage pass, and the intoxicating chaos of live rock and roll make it worthwhile. But there's one show I'll never forget, one that still makes my hands tremble every time I touch a six string. The night I worked for Crimson Howl. Crimson Howl wasn't a household name, but they had a cult following. Their music was raw, aggressive, and tinged with an eerie undercurrent that unsettled even their most die-hard fans. They weren't like other bands, there was an edge to their sound, a haunting resonance that didn't just shake your bones but gnawed at your very soul. I got the gig through a friend of a friend. The band had an impromptu show in a forgotten venue deep in the Appalachian foothills. It wasn't a place you'd find on a map, but the fans, those rabid, devoted fans, seemed to know exactly where to go. The venue was called the Devil's Stage, a dilapidated theater shrouded in fog and legend. Locals claimed it was cursed, a place where performers disappeared, their music echoing through the surrounding woods long after they were gone. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun barely piercing the dense canopy of trees. The band was already there, their gear scattered across the stage. Crimson Howl's lead singer, Vince Graves, was a towering figure with hollow eyes and a voice that could both soothe and terrify. He barely acknowledged me, too engrossed in tuning his battered Gibson Les Paul. The rest of the band was equally strange. There was Mara, the bassist, who never spoke but played with a precision that felt mechanical, almost inhuman. Eddie, the drummer, had a nervous tic that made him twitch constantly, except when he was behind his kit. And then there was Dax, the lead guitarist, whose fingers moved across the strings as if possessed, conjuring riffs that sounded like screams from another world. As the sun set, the fans began to arrive. They came in droves, emerging from the woods like shadows come to life. They were an eclectic mix, leather-clad punks, corporate types in wrinkled suits, and wide-eyed teenagers clutching vinyl records. By the time Crimson Howl took the stage, the theater was packed, the air electric with anticipation. The first chord hit like a sledgehammer, a low rumbling note that reverberated through the walls and rattled the floorboards. The crowd erupted, their cheers turning into a frenzied chant. The band launched into their set, each song more intense than the last. The music was hypnotic, a cacophony of distorted guitars and thunderous drums that seemed to bypass your ears and burrow straight into your brain. But something was wrong. The sound wasn't just loud, it was alive. The notes twisted and writhed in the air, forming shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. The stage lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that didn't match the movements of the band. Halfway through the set, Vince stepped up to the mic. His voice was guttural, almost unrecognizable. "This next song," he growled, "is for those who dare to listen." The band launched into a new track, one I'd never heard before. The melody was haunting, the kind of tune that clings to your mind like a parasite. And then the screaming started. It wasn't coming from the crowd, it was coming from the speakers. Voices, hundreds of them, layered over the music, wailing in anguish. The crowd froze, their cheers replaced by wide-eyed terror. On stage, the band played on, their faces emotionless, as if they were puppets controlled by unseen strings. I tried to move, to pull the plug on the soundboard, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the music had paralyzed me, forcing me to watch as the nightmare unfolded. The shadows on the walls began to twist and grow, forming grotesque figures that reached toward the audience. One by one, people began to collapse, their bodies convulsing in time with the beat. The song reached its climax, a bone-chilling crescendo that felt like it would tear the world apart. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence. The crowd lay motionless, their eyes vacant, their bodies unnaturally still. On stage, the band stood frozen, their instruments hanging limply in their hands. And then Vince spoke. "Thank you for joining us," he said, his voice dripping with malevolence. "You've given us what we need." The band began to laugh, a chilling sound that echoed through the empty theater. One by one they turned and walked off stage, disappearing into the darkness. When I finally regained control of my body, I stumbled outside. The fans were gone, leaving behind only the faint echo of their screams. I drove away as fast as I could, vowing never to return. Weeks later, I tried to find information about Crimson Howl. Their social media accounts were gone, their music scrubbed from streaming platforms. It was as if they'd never existed. But sometimes late at night, I hear that haunting melody, faint and distant, as if calling me back to the devil's stage. And I know that somewhere Crimson Howl is still playing, feeding on the souls of those who dare to listen. The day the wind came alive was the day everything changed in Willowbrook. It began innocently enough. A warm spring afternoon, the kind that pulls families outdoors and paints the sky with the vibrant colors of kites. Kids laughed as their creations danced and looped in the air, and adults watched from lawn chairs, sipping lemonade. The annual Willowbrook Kite Festival was in full swing. At the edge of the field, a peculiar stall caught my eye. Amid the booths selling popcorn and trinkets stood a small wooden cart, its paint faded and peeling. Above it, a hand-painted sign read, "The Sky's Secrets, Kites That Speak." The vendor was an old man with a crooked smile and eyes that seemed to hold storms within them. Spread before him were kites unlike any I'd ever seen. Their fabrics shimmered unnaturally, shifting between patterns as if alive. "Care for a kite, miss?" he asked, his voice raspy yet soothing. I hesitated. Something about the way his words lingered in the air sent a shiver down my spine. "What's so special about these?" He chuckled, leaning closer. "These kites, they don't just fly. They speak. They whisper truths carried on the winds. But be warned, some truths are best left unheard." I should have walked away, but curiosity rooted me in place. After a moment's pause, I chose a kite, a deep crimson one, its edges trimmed with black. It was beautiful, mesmerizing even. As I handed him the money, he gripped my hand firmly. "Don't let it fly too high or you might lose more than the kite." The festival field was packed with families, their laughter and shouts filling the air. I found a quiet corner away from the bustling crowd, and prepared to test my new kite. The moment it caught the wind, something changed. The world seemed to quiet, the chatter of the festival fading to a distant hum. The kite soared effortlessly, its crimson fabric glowing against the blue sky. Then it spoke. At first it was faint, a soft whisper carried by the wind. I dismissed it as my imagination. But as the kite climbed higher, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Jessica." I froze. My name. I looked around, but no one was near me. The whispers continued, intertwining with the gusts of wind. "Do you remember? The swing?" My chest tightened. The swing. The memory surged forward. My childhood best friend, Lily, laughing as we pushed each other on the old swing behind my house. The last day I saw her before she vanished. The kite tugged harder against the string, pulling as if it had a mind of its own. I tightened my grip, my heart racing. "Jessica," the whispers grew insistent. "The swing, the woods, you left her." Tears stung my eyes. I hadn't thought about that day in years. Lily had begged me to go into the woods with her, but I was scared. I ran home, leaving her behind. By the time anyone realized she was missing, it was too late. "No," I yelled, pulling the kite closer. "It wasn't my fault." The kite twisted violently in the air, its whispers turning into an almost mocking laughter. The wind around me intensified, swirling like a vortex. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a single chilling sentence. "She's still there." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. The kite pulled harder, jerking me toward the edge of the field. I stumbled but refused to let go. The whispers became a chant, a chorus of voices urging me forward. Find her. Find her. Find her. Before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the woods. The kite tugged insistently, leading me deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, the sunlight dimming as the trees thickened. The whispers guided me, growing louder with each step. I reached the old swing. It was still there, swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. Beneath it, the ground looked disturbed as if something, or someone, had been buried there. Dig, the kite commanded. My hands trembled as I dropped the string and began clawing at the dirt. My nails broke and blood smeared the soil, but I couldn't stop. After what felt like hours, my fingers scraped against something hard. A box. I pulled it free and pried it open. Inside was a single, tattered shoe. Lily's shoe. The whispers grew deafening. You left her. You abandoned her. No. I screamed, clutching the shoe. It wasn't my fault. The wind around me roared, the kite spiraling wildly above. Shadows emerged from the trees, their forms indistinct but menacing. They circled me, their voices joining the chant. You must make it right. The kite descended slowly, hovering just above my head. Its fabric shifted, forming a face, Lily's face. Her eyes stared into mine, filled with sorrow and accusation. Why did you leave me, Jessica? I'm sorry, I sobbed, collapsing to my knees. I was scared. I didn't know. The face softened, but the whispers didn't stop. You can fix this, Lily said. You can bring me back. The kite drifted down, its string wrapping around my wrist. I felt a sharp pain as it tightened, cutting into my skin. The world around me spun, the shadows closing in. Fly higher, Lily's voice urged. Bring me back. With trembling hands, I stood and let the kite rise. It climbed impossibly high, disappearing into the darkened sky. The string burned against my palm, but I didn't let go. As the kite vanished, the world around me shifted. The forest grew silent, the air heavy with anticipation. And then I heard it, a laugh. I turned to see Lily, her small form emerging from the shadows. She looked exactly as I remembered, her smile bright and mischievous. Thank you, she whispered before turning and disappearing into the woods. When I returned to the festival field, the world felt different. The sky was brighter, the air lighter. The old man and his cart were gone, leaving no trace behind. I looked down at my hands, the kite string still wrapped around my wrist. But the kite was gone, its whispers replaced by silence. Even now, I wonder if it was real. But sometimes on windy days, I hear a familiar voice calling my name, carried by the breeze.